Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at this thing called human rights and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And you get the impression when you hear the term the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, that is an impartial system or document based on something that is universal and that it applies to everybody equally, and that it was designed in such a way that it's not coming from any racial bias or any kind of cultural view of the world. But the reality is, the way the document was drafted and the mindset behind the drafting of the document and the understanding of rights is very Western and individualistic from its very beginning. So I'll be looking at the history of the idea of human rights, and also looking at the drafting of the document and some of the perspective of rights coming from not just the Western perspective, but from some from the global South. So I think I'll start with looking at the background and this idea of the notion of rights and where it actually began. So there are two documents that I'll be looking at. One is a book or a research paper, basically. It's called The Concept of Human Rights, a Qualitative Content Analysis of the Declaration of the United Nations, ASEAN, and the African Union. And then the other one is a paper called The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism. So that one already tells you that there's some connection between the Western thinking and the concept of human rights. So in terms of the beginnings of this human rights idea, or program, you could almost call it, from one of the documents, the notion of rights in Western society originates from the concept of natural law, which can be traced back to the ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, and religious texts. Natural law refers to the belief that there are legal principles inherent in human nature, while natural law touched on the idea of rights early in history. It was during the Enlightenment period that philosophers and social contract theorists provided rights with a more robust philosophical foundation by emphasizing the pursuit of freedom and equality. And this idea of freedom from oppression and freedom to pursue and be equal to others within our society, it stems really from how Western states developed in terms of the leadership or the governing bodies of their countries or states or kingdoms oppressing the ordinary people. So what developed was a system or an idea or concept in which the people wanted freedom from being oppressed by their leaders. So the Western notion of rights is developed out of an oppressive system that had been oppressing them. Continuing, initially rights were only granted to free men, as seen in ancient Greece, but then during the 18th century and with the Enlightenment, they were granted to members of certain churches or citizens of specific states. Later, with the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, human rights were seen on a universal level. Natural law was replaced by the concept of human rights, and what were once considered rights for a particular group began to apply to all people all over the world. And one of the reasons why this idea of applying it to people all over the world came out of the idea of forming the United Nations as a Western-initiated organization in which the West could bring in the rest of the world into their international structure, but at the same time have their own control by the way of indoctrinating the people that they bring into the Western way of thinking and looking at the world. Because the document itself is mainly focused on individual rights rather than collective rights, as I will be talking about in a while. So continuing, a number of scholars, both Enlightenment thinkers and theorists, but also others such as Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, and David Hume have argued for the concept of universalism as in fundamental human essence or natural or nature that consists of foreseeable tendencies and stable instincts and emotions, all of which can be subject to rational inquiry and analysis. All of this talk that particularly the last sentence that I mentioned, it speaks about rationality and this idea of rational inquiry and analysis. But there's no mention of any kind of spiritual understanding of the nature of man. They're looking at man in terms of an individual rather than man as to how he fits into a society or a clan or a family line. So their understanding is protecting the freedoms of the individual, not what the individual or how the individual is supposed to live within a society or a group. So this is dealing now with the first, because there are 3 generations of rights. The first generation of rights emerged from the American and French revolutions. These are around the 17th century and encompass civil and political rights. So this concept of rights is developing something that was developing within Western societies, or these entitlements you might call them. Because right sounds a bit dubious sometimes. These rights revolved around individual entitlements and assurances from the state. The declaration of these 2 states documented these rights. The first generation of rights was centered on the individual liberties, such as the right to political freedom, freedom of assembly, and the right not to be unlawfully detained. Moreover, the right to own and use property was also considered, but the right to own property was limited to certain wealthy Europeans, wealthy men at one time. Women at one time in European society didn't really have this thing that they call rights. So that's I look at the early stages of the development of these rights. But in terms of the drafting of the document itself, then I'll be looking at that next. So that's the thinking that went into the development of but there's also thinking based on, there are 2 schools of thought in Western, I wouldn't say the West, East and Western white world. You had the East, which is Russia, dealing with communism. And then you had the capitalist, neoliberalist mindset, which was focused more on the individual. And when the document was being drafted, the declaration was being drafted, there was especially strong effort to keep out the communist mindset out of the document. So a lot of effort was focused on the individual rights, that angle that they wanted to emphasize in the document, because that would benefit their worldview more. The drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights involved people from various cultural and religious backgrounds, but its universality has been a subject of debate and criticism. Scholars from the Western liberal school of thought tend to argue for its universality, pointing to the significant number of states that have ratified the declaration. However, other scholars have analyzed the influence of liberal ideology on the document and expressed doubt about its universal applicability. The fact that many countries had ratified it, many of them were, in fact, the former colonies or states that were influenced by the West. So the fact that countries ratified it doesn't mean that they accept it with full independence of their own thinking. It was adapted because they were being influenced by the Western way of looking at the world. The working committee that contributed to the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights comprised various individuals, including Eleanor Roosevelt, I think she was the wife of the president at the time, Hansa Mitcha from India, Carlos Romolo from Philippines, Peng Chang from China, René Cassin from France, Charles Malik from Lebanon, and John Humphrey from Canada. There are others included, but these are the names that they mentioned. The committee also had a separate subcommittees led by historian E.H. Carr from Great Britain, which developed a philosophical foundation for the concept. So although it's showing people who contributed to the declaration were from various parts of the world, from China to Philippines, to Lebanon, even India. But the main ethos or framework of the of the document was around individualism, which means the Western way of looking at the world was the dominant factor in the document. I'll be comparing it to two other charters to give a clearer idea of what I'm saying later on. During the development of the Declaration, there were extensive debates within the Working Committee regarding the role of individualism and collectivism in establishing universal rights articles. Some members of the group had an existential philosophical standpoint which prioritized the individual in the Declaration, citing the need to protect individuals after the widespread crimes and violations that occurred during World War II. Others argued that the focus on individual rights was response to Nazi abuse of group rights, including the annexations and interventions in Eastern Europe, which were justified by the guys. So these are some of the reasonings behind why the individualism was focused. It's clear to see that things that were happening in Europe were the dominant factors in bringing that frame of mind into play or into the document. So dealing with the working group again, they stressed the significance of individualism, as I was saying. But there's a member, this Chang, strongly opposed this individualistic idea. Even states that abstained from the voting for the Declaration cited individualism as a reason for not being part of it. So basically saying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not universally embraced during its adoption or the drafting of the document itself. In 1948, South Africa, which I expected not to be part of it, Saudi Arabia and the Eastern Bloc were several areas which were not really part of it because some African states, for example, by that time had not been given independence yet, so their contribution was not there. So only 56 countries had the opportunity to vote in the UN, compared to today's more than double the number of member states. More than triple, in fact, almost quadruple. These countries expressed criticism about the Declaration's emphasis on civil and political rights. So, there's some history behind the drafting of the document and the fact that there was some contentions over the concept of the individuality aspect of the document. One major challenge that the UN faced during the drafting process of the document in the 1940s was a struggle of not agreeing on the concept of universal, because when you say universal, you're giving the impression that all countries from around the world agree on the concept of individual human rights, or that the document should be the document is seen by all parties as something that is correct and positive. But as we'll see later on with the other charters from the African Union and from Asia, their focus on group rights and collective rights is more prominent in their document than in the UN's document. So that's looking at the drafting of this document. But in terms of the Western character or the Western influence on the Declaration of Human Rights or the concept of rights, I'll be looking at that next. So, universalism is a philosophical and ethical concept that advocates and places great emphasis on the idea of principles and values being universal and applicable to all human families, regardless of who you are. It refers to the belief that every human is entitled to human rights regardless of ethnicity, nationality, religion, or other characteristics. Those things sound fine, but the focus on the document is about the freedoms of individuals as opposed to the obligations and duties of individuals. Obligations and duties will give more of an impression of where the person fits in society rather than looking at what they're entitled to and their freedoms, which tends to give the impression of people being more separate and doing their own thing as opposed to working as a collective. So this is reflected by in the premise formula of everyone that is repeatedly found in the UDHR and in the preamble of the Declaration, which reads, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. Yeah, you can talk about inalienable freedoms and human dignity, but dignity also depends on the person's behavior. You don't look at an evil person saying that they're behaving dignified. How they should be treated as a human being, yes, to a certain extent, but how you interact in society can also determine whether you should be treated with any level of respect or not. And this is part of the duties and obligations side of this rights debate. So, continuing. Post-colonial scholars such as Mutwa has highlighted the connection between the current human rights system articulated in the UDHR and the liberal school of thought, the UDHR being dominated by the Western liberal culture. The spread of it through the UN and its legal frameworks is by post-colonial scholars seen as a spread of Western liberal norms and standards, which is correct. The way it was drafted and even the concept of individual rights, which is the main focus of the document, as I was saying, is a Western construct, really. So it was ratified in 1948, and neoliberals worked hard to counter these democratic trends that were present in the document, and they did this by generating widely and publishing an alternative vision of rights and installed the right to poverty as an absolutely central tenet of the new liberal orthodoxy. Imagine making sure that there's a right to poverty in a document because it wanted to focus, it wanted that possibility of the rich being seen as a normal part of society. The equality that is supposed to be within the UN document, they wanted to remove that aspect, or the social, the social aspect of the declaration, where the social aspect being looking at how everyday people are treated within society, as opposed to just focusing on having a society where an individualistic society is a society where individuals are allowed to get rich, and then you have individuals who are poor. There's no equitable system there that to make sure that the rich don't become too rich and the poor don't become too poor. So what they were arguing in their alternative vision of rights is having a system in which these two features could be there, the rich and the poor could be there, which would allow the rich to continue earning their and accumulating their wealth. In White's own formulation, the drafters of the UDHR developed a count of social and economic rights that was ultimately compatible with privatized neoliberal approach to the management of poverty, which means they could keep poverty there. The next part. However, some in the post-colonial spectrum perceive certain intergovernmental organizations, such as the UN and the World Bank, these are Western-controlled institutions, as instruments of the West to expand its power. One notable post-colonial thinker who shares this view is Jalal Ahmed, who cites the example of the Congo, where the UN allegedly prioritized Belgian and British interests over the welfare of the people, ultimately resulting in the death of the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. That was, I think, in the 60s. So, that's some of the Western understanding. So let's take a look at the African Charter. As I said earlier on, I was going to have a look at it and compare it to the UN Charter. So all African states have acceded to the 1981 adopted African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The Charter's preamble acknowledges the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, while also emphasizing the importance of African civilization's values, traditions in reflecting the concept of human and people's rights. The African Charter serves as a supplementary document to the UN Declaration by incorporating values that were significant to African societies, although there's still a strong focus on individual rights even in the African Charter. The preamble of the African Declaration states that civil and political rights cannot be separated from economic, social, and cultural rights. The African Union believes that one category of rights is necessary to fulfill other groups of rights. Therefore, the fulfillment of civil and political rights is a guarantor for the enjoyment of socio-economic and cultural rights. True. Anyway, the last part on the African Charter. The African Charter not only provides protection to individuals, but also emphasizes the importance of understanding individuals in their social context. This includes the individual's obligations towards their family, society, such as supporting their parents in old age. Yeah, those are obligations and duties. But still, if you look at African societies today, this focus on individualism is clear to see. People's lifestyles have changed. There's less focus. The family life is still there, but people have become more individualistic, seeking out their own wealth. So many traveling, not many, some traveling abroad. Even within the societies on the continent, there is a lot of Western-mindedness developing. Anyway, specifically states that rights and freedoms should be exercised while taking into account obligations towards other individuals, collective security, morality, and the common interest of a society. So that is the African rights. Looking at both the African and the Asian rights, in terms of the similarities, the Asian societies and African societies both focus more on collective rights than the European. The European seems to be, the system developed under the UN via the European mindset seems to be focused on individuality, and as if they want to separate people so that the wealthy can continue to make their wealth. And the fact that there's a lack of spiritual understanding within their rights concept, and the lack of, in the Western world, traditional cultures have disappeared, and they disappeared long before Christianity has been, as long as Christianity has been taken hold in the West, you will find that the individualistic mindset has also developed. Anyway, let me continue with the Asian and the African understandings of rights. African societies held the belief that rights were not only attributed to the individual, but that the individual also had the responsibilities towards society. Therefore, rights and obligations were viewed, as I said. Similarly, the South Asian Declaration on Human Rights states that the enjoyment of human rights should be balanced with corresponding obligations towards other people and society itself. Continuing, this is two charters, two articles in the African Charter, Articles 7 and 26. The right that every individuals have to an appeal, this is to do with the legal process within the Charter, to appeal to a national court against actions of violence of fundamental rights. The Charter also establishes a procedure for individual complainants to be considered by the African Commission on Human Rights, Human and People's Rights, which has the mandate to protect these rights. In the Asian system, Asian Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights is the body responsible for the protection of human rights in the ASEAN region. And in its preamble of its declaration, states that every individual has the right to an effective and enforceable remedy that is established by a court for acts violating the rights of the individual. So again, these two legal aspects are also focused on the individual. maybe it does mention, but it should also mention, legal aspects of that apply to the group or to the society itself, how the individual is obligated somehow legally to behave a particular way within the society. So here it's saying the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the African Charter and the Southeast Asian Declaration emphasize the importance of democratic principles. This part I included it because the fact that it's mentioning democratic principles and the democratic idea that they mention is obviously the Western understanding of democracy. This democracy of ballot box, which most countries around the world have adopted. So even talking about the systems of governance that are supposed to be in existence across the world, the UN defends the Western democracy type or style of governance. Monarchy, in fact, is seen as something that is evil and terrible in current times by Western societies, yet many traditional societies were monarchies, and many monarchies still exist across the world, even here on the continent, but they don't have political power because of the colonial process that removed their political power. They now fit within the borders that were created during colonial times, and the governance systems that were developed by the West are still in existence, and the kingdoms that exist within those territories have lost their political power. So that's the look at the Asian and African rights. So that's a brief look at this human rights issue and how it was drafted, and the fact that there was a lot of Western influence in the drafting of this thing called the Declaration of Human Rights. And I wouldn't say it was initiated by the Western countries because of World War II, the two world wars, World War I and World War II. It came up with this concept of developing rights to because of the mistreatment of people during the wars. Also, from the 1815, they formed their Concert of Europe in order for European countries not to battle against each other, but to sit down and discuss whatever issues they had. The League of Nations was the expansion of that to include more countries outside of Europe, and then it was expanded even again after the World War II to form the United Nations, which now included almost the whole world. Nowadays it includes almost the whole world. So these frameworks are created by Europeans under their own structures in order to organize the world and frame the mindset of people's thinking in the world, or how they think, the Europeans think that they should be looking at the world in terms of the individualistic mindset. You find that socialist or congruative types of mindset are not included in the Western understanding of the world. It's individualism, I would say, and neoliberalism, this idea of capitalism and property owning. Concepts such as the physical ownership of land never existed in certain societies, global South societies. These are frames of mind or ways of thinking that were brought into many global South countries coming from the West. So land was shared, and it was more a communal type of lifestyle where land was used but it was not owned, and this idea of wealth through property ownership didn't really exist. So only because of the coming of the Europeans into the global atmosphere that you find the world's thinking, the way the world looks at itself is completely different from the way it was, say, 500 or 600 years ago, or even sooner than that. The colonization process didn't take place until less than 200 years ago, even though they were capturing people from Africa since the 15th century. Anyway, I think that is it for now.